Hola, ¿qué tal? Me da muchísimo gusto saludarles en nombre de la Cátedra Max AU de la Unidad Académica de Cultura UNAM a este simposio Prototipos para Navegar un Futuro Contingente, una serie de conversaciones en donde nos enfocaremos en la función del prototipo como laboratorio transdisciplinario para la co-creación de futuros posibles. Quiero muy especialmente agradecer a todos los colaboradores, especialmente a Casa del Lago, Cintia García Leiva, por la organización y el apoyo para esta conversación en específico, y a los co-curadores y organizadores, a Rayane Cantoni, a Juan Pablo de la Vega y a Finela Halligan, y también a todo el equipo que hace posible esta conversación. Voy a dar, bueno, les comento acerca de la conversación que tendremos. El título es Al margen de la mirada algorítmica, reconocimiento facial y herramientas antivigilancia, y en ella participan Federico Pérez Villoro, Nora N y van a ser moderados por Diego Gerard. Les leo. En esta conversación, la escritora Nora N y el artista Federico Pérez Villoro discutirán sobre el reciente surgimiento de tecnologías de reconocimiento facial y la posibilidad de moverse en el espacio fuera del rango de visión de estos sistemas. Tomarán como punto de partida el prototipo de una aplicación para celular que está siendo desarrollada por Pérez Villoro para el mapeo colectivo de las locaciones de cientos de cámaras de reconocimiento facial que han sido instaladas en los últimos meses en Coahuila, el primer estado en implementar esta tecnología en este país, México. Siendo un lugar en donde es difícil distinguir entre el gobierno y el crimen organizado, Coahuila se convierte en un caso de estudio inevitable sobre la simulación de seguridad a través de medios tecnológicos y sobre cómo las llamadas ciudades inteligentes dependen de un espectro de violencia perpetrada por entidades abstractas a las que se les teme. Dentro de una reflexión más amplia sobre tecnologías de vigilancia, la conversación abordará los muchos problemas presentes en algoritmos inescrutables que cancelan la diferencia humana representativa en su intento de identificar personas. Y para presentar a quienes llevarán esta conversación, Nora N. Ella es escritora de crítica sobre la cultura visual digital y la filosofía de la tecnología emergente. Su investigación se centra específicamente en el arte experimental y las prácticas musicales que hacen argumentos a través de software, el aprendizaje automático y la inteligencia artificial. Nora enseña a estudiantes de posgrado, les da clase de teoría crítica, investigación artística, también da clases de escritura crítica para artistas y diseñadores e historia de los medios digitales. Diego Gerard, quien va a moderar, es escritor, editor y traductor, es cofundador de Disonare. Su ficción, traducciones y entrevistas y otros escritos han aparecido en The Brooklyn Rail, The Roanoke Review, The River Rail, Terremoto, Boiler House Press, White Fungus, Juan de la Cosa y Antifaz, entre otros. Federico Pérez Villoro es artista e investigador, vive y trabaja en la Ciudad de México. A través de textos, performances y artefactos digitales, explora la materialidad del lenguaje y el impacto de la tecnología en el comportamiento sociopolítico. Recientemente fundó Materia Abierta, una escuela de verano sobre teoría, arte y tecnología en la Ciudad de México, con quien también tenemos el enorme orgullo de colaborar. Y bueno, cedo la palabra a Diego Gerard. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Muchas gracias.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank everyone who's making this talk possible because we're referring to issues that are very urgent in our times. I first came into contact with the work of Nora N in the winter of 2019 with her essay, Seeing, Naming, Knowing, which goes into great detail about how we live in a world that's ubiquitous with technology, facial recognition, and how our behavior develops under the scope of these machines. I had the great honor to translate her book into the Spanish as Ver, Nombrar, Saber. And as I was translating, I was only keeping in mind how I wish I was someone with the knowledge as Fede Pérez Villoro, who is here with us today. He will talk about the recent implementation of facial recognition in Mexico, in the state of Coahuila, and of the dangers that we face under their gaze. Nora will then share her knowledge as based in her book. And I want to thank Fede and lead him on into his presentation about the search of facial recognition in the state of Coahuila. Thank you, Fede.
Can you see my slides? Well, thank you everyone for being part of this event. Thanks for the organizing to Cátedra Maxab and to Nora, who very generously accepted to be part of this conversation, and to Diego as well for being part of it and for moderating it. I'm gonna quickly go through a presentation to give a little bit more of context on the Coahuila case, which is developing as we speak. So I'll present some notions around that, and then we'll move to a more kind of like back and forth conversation. But I did wanted to share with you some images and some of the research we're working on. At the end of the day, this conversation is in the context of the Symposium on Prototypes. So we did wanted to discuss that more directly. So we'll be sharing a working prototype of a tool I'm developing collaboration with other people that I'll name in a few seconds. But yeah, anyway, I'll start with this presentation. In Coahuila, Coahuila is the first state in Mexico to implement a facial recognition system. And therefore, I think it will set very important precedents regarding the future of this technology in the country. In collaboration with Paloma Robles, an investigative journalism agency, Quinto Elemento Lab, and also in coordination with lawyers and with a couple of nonprofit organizations, we've been researching the case of Coahuila, and we actually just published an article on it. And the case of Coahuila is particular because it is the story of a surveillance system that seems to be failing to be implemented by the government as they expected. The government bought a highly sophisticated technology from Dawa, a company that is sponsored by the Chinese state, but didn't seem to anticipate the many technical and legal, political also challenges that they're facing now in order to implement the technology. But anyway, in short, the government doesn't have access to federal databases or enough computational space, memory to power the technology. There is also a lack of laws and regulations in Mexico specifically in order to secure human rights, and also the efforts that the authorities are performing in order to protect privacy and other rights from citizens seem to be superficial, if not deceptive. Well, our research portrays the technology not as a security device, but as a political tool, and also as a diplomatic resource to strengthen relationships with China. However, even with all of these obstacles, being the first system of its kind in the country, we think that it allows for a much more ample conversation on the ethical and political implications and the threats to human rights of these technologies. And there are many angles to our analysis, but for the sake of this conversation, I will focus on the location of the cameras and what they seem to reveal about the government projects at large. The exact locations of the system are being protected by the government. However, we did get access to a general technical breakdown of the installation and to the areas in which the cameras are installed. And this is just a slide showing some of those numbers. Analyzing these numbers, these specs in comparison to the latest indicators of violence in the region, it is clear that the project was not developed to fight organized crime as it is advertised, but to generate a false, or what we think is a false sense of safety in urban areas. The locations of the cameras do not overlap with crime patterns in the region of Coahuila. Furthermore, in a mapping exercise we did in the field, we realized that more than 65% of the cameras in Torreon, which is a major city in Coahuila, are distributed only in 2 wealthy neighborhoods. When you look at the system a bit closer, it's clear, or you could think that it is designed to simulate security for wealthy populations and not really to prevent crime in the larger region of the state. And these locations are, of course, important to prove the distance or this distance between how the project is presented by the government publicly and its real implementation, but it's also a citizen's right to know the locations of the cameras and to be able to protect their privacy by knowing them. There is international consensus on the need for these systems to disclose their locations and for people to be able to consent to the identification process. So when we were in Coahuila, we mapped the field marking Google Maps and making notes in our, with pen and pencil, basically. However, when you're looking for the locations of surveillance systems, you definitely feel surveilled. Driving in circles, photographing security cameras, stopping in the middle of the road to make a note kind of make you feel suspicious. So we successfully mapped the neighborhoods on our list, but we quickly realized as well that there should be an easier way to perform this task in the streets, but also to compile the information that we collected. So I started working on an app that it's processed. This is in collaboration with developer Carlos Jimenez Velado. And in the spirit of this discussion on prototypes, on this event on prototypes, I'll share some of this work in progress, but please keep in mind that it's not finished by any means. But I'm hoping that it's useful for our conversation as a starting point and to be able to kind of like branch out to discuss the many issues that are present in facial recognition technologies. So the working prototype is being designed to allow a group of volunteers to mark locations and complete the map of the system in Coahuila. It is pretty straightforward. You can use existing locations and add data to the map, or if you're in the field, you can also add data using your phone's geolocation for more or like better accuracy. But there are a few tiers of information. For instance, what we're really mapping are not camera locations, but surveillance points with multiple cameras of different models. The app allows you to fill forms where you can add such information and include images and notes and things like that. All the data is collected and is then organized in a database that allows us as well to develop like future analysis. For example, if we want to compare information of a specific model with that of, with information that is provided by the government, for example, or present information in more granular ways. And again, this is a version, or like this version of the app is taught for a group of inspectors collaborating to build the map. You can access the information of the other inspectors, but also organize tasks among groups of people in a shared calendar. The application, we think, works well already to specify the locations of the cameras on a map of Coahuila by groups of trusted volunteers. But the hope is to take it to a place where it could become a public tool for anyone to upload and verify locations. This is an app to crowdsource the surveillance map. But there are, of course, many technical and design challenges to make such a tool. And here I would like to thank my colleague, Nick Schumann, with whom I've been brainstorming some of these things to consider as we move forward with the development of the app. The first concept that I wanted to share with you is the idea of the range of vision, right? In order for the information of the locations of the cameras to be really useful, we actually need to know where the cameras are pointing and what's the area that they're capturing. And these are difficult quantities, of course, for people to estimate. Therefore, we actually need to collect the specifications of the cameras, the models, which is also confidential information, or information that at least is being protected by the government. We do have some of those specifications already, but we need to complete them for sure. Then the notion, the idea of like providing a false sense of safety, right? We wonder if the app can really guarantee the location of surveilled spaces. The stakes seems to be pretty high, as the state of Coahuila is already performing arrests of people of the camera's data, and the violence of Coahuila is reality. So it seems possible that the app would have incomplete information and therefore provide a false sense of privacy. And this is something for sure that we should consider and figure out how to deal with a potential incomplete map. Then a third notion, a third concept that it's important for us to consider as we move forward is the possibility of adversarial actors, right? The application is or could be a direct threat to the surveillance project in Coahuila. So if it is open to the public, what's stopping state actors from using the app to mark false locations of cameras or to hijack the system in some fashion? So what are the safeguards we can design against this, and what are the verification methods that we could provide in the design of the application? So once there is a more complete version of the map, we want, or the idea is to design a complementary version of the app in an almost game-like fashion to provide safe routes between locations. The idea is, yeah, you would be able to move from a point to another without being seen or skewing basically the facial recognition system. The app wouldn't actually like guarantee safety, but instead would calculate some risk factor for any given route. For instance, it would tell you the amount of cameras you would encounter if you travel a particular route, or the countermeasures space-wise you could take in order to avoid them. And the aim of this app is for sure to be a tactical resource, but also a discursive mechanism to ponder on the possibility for bodies to move in space outside the constraints of surveillance apparatuses. As they skew the location of the cameras, the routes provided by the app we think would be uncomfortable and likely nonsensical, but they will also become political and poetic in this absurdity. As you see, there is much work to be done, but I cannot think of anyone better than you, Nora, to share this process and socialize ideas with, not only for your own research on surveillance technologies in Detroit and other places, but also on your work on gaming and simulation. And I'm definitely expecting, I don't expect this conversation to be only on this particular tool, but rather to be an exchange of ideas more generally and broadly on the many threats that facial recognition pose. And I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on the kind of like more open-ended understanding of prototyping. On the one hand, we could consider anti-surveillance tools for the making of more just futures, but it's also could be also interesting to discuss the notion of a city as a prototype, right? So Coahuila or Detroit as prototypes or surveillance programs and simulations of like this kind of like ramping oppressive realities that seem to be organized by the logics of AI. So that's all from my presentation, and I think, maybe Nora, you'll share your screen as well, right?
Yes, I will. Thank you so much, Fede. Thank you so much for inviting me, and Diego for the lovely introduction as well. I'm super excited to be here. It's really nice to, Diego, to see you again after a year. I think you were one of the last people that I saw outside of my city back at the beginning of this year. Yeah, so can you see my screen fine? Okay, great. Let me just expand this. Okay, great. So last year when I first met Diego and we were engaged in the process of translating Seeing, Naming, Knowing, we began a conversation back then about the translation of the Detroit context to that of Mexico City. And I was struck then, as I am still now, by Diego's description of the process of translation, that there were ways to make the project of surveillance both legible locally while keeping true to the abstraction of the model. And so what was really thrilling about this translation process was this idea of a collective process of decoding and translating and framing surveillance, and our discussion back and forth about the text from English into Spanish, and the need for more than one perspective in decoding the opacity of surveillance. So at that time, I was living in Detroit, Michigan, and I was looking at the cameras of a project called Project Greenlight and was writing about them. And currently I'm in Providence in New England, and I check in for surveillance testing before teaching on campus. And I think about the efficacy of surveillance as COVID is spiking in our area. And I'm looking closely right now at the narrative around safe surveillance, in which we understand safety as a function of rhetoric and fiction as much as a function of actual technological tools. So what I'm struck by in Coahuila is that we find some key comparisons with Project Greenlight, in which the surveillance is placed near areas of high value and wealthy neighborhoods. As in Detroit, the cameras are placed near businesses that tend to purchase the camera. And in both of these situations, public safety begins with the empowered, those who are likely to say, if you have nothing to hide, then the camera shouldn't matter, which is one of the most chilling phrases that I can think of. And I'm also struck by the comparisons between Detroit and other cities and the way in which the logic of surveillance is, because quantifiable, an exported model, and a model that you can replicate and track as being quite similar from city to city. So even within the grimness of the subject of surveillance, it's actually quite empowering, I would argue, to know that if you know the model, you can identify it and you can identify how it functions. So this year I've been writing a lot about remembering this model in the absence of physical presence and physical communication with one another. In our absence and distance from each other, I'm really struck by this image that, Diego, you shared of the cameras under this billboard of healthcare workers up against the flag above a walkway. I mean, there's just so much going on in this image. So we could spend, I'm sure, this whole time unpacking this. And this moment, this year, is really crucial as the imperatives of surveillance testing, of tracking this unknown virus or the unseen virus, map atop general ambient fears of insecurity. And we're primed to internalize the logics of surveillance and the logics of capture. So we can understand surveillance as iterative and coming in tiny, slow steps, and also as coming in waves of language, contact tracing, surveillance testing, tracing of protesters, tracing of a virus, to form a kind of protocol for surveillance, a wide system of surveillance. So surveillance is tested on so many fronts: epidemiological, technological, and rhetorical. And so just in the next 8 minutes or so, I'd love to offer a few thoughts on Fede's very exciting prototype, as it helps us trace not just physical cameras, but can also help us open up a conversation about all of the different ways we have to consider surveillance, not just as a physical process or quantified process, but a mental process that we are seduced into, and one that none of us are free from. The first theme is surveillance as a process that unfolds, that takes place over time. Surveillance doesn't happen overnight, but instead is cast in prototypes, it's tested and refined. And to get to an ideal final version, it has to get through the bad versions. And of course, we're caught up in the bad versions. So I'm describing this process as one that is both mental and a mathematical process. It's both a digital technology, an algorithmic technology, and a process of making a fiction. It's a way of creating a model of behavior that's expected, and then the world enacts that model. And we are part of that. We do this in the mind. The second is the ambient space that surveilling establishes. Fede mentioned the counter surveillance, or the act of counter surveilling a camera creates a kind of paranoia or unease, which is why I think the prospect of countermapping and making countermapping accessible and normal to create this kind of friction of counterseeing is really vital. So the very existence of a camera, whether it's on or off, changes our relationship to each other and to the space of the city that we move within. So free movement is curtailed. The protests here in the States have made this very clear. When you're captured on camera, it's both vital for your own safety, but it's also material for others to frame and reframe you. The third is that surveillance is as much rhetorical movement and a fictional project as a physical reality, which I've been building up to a bit. Surveillance depends on a kind of branding language. There's a lip service that you'll hear to the protection of your personal information, the protection of your body against threats. And these promises of security generate a fiction of truth and a fiction of faith and automation as truth, of being able to fully know a threat, that the camera can take an image and fully understand what a threat is, in which a threat becomes a kind of roving abstraction as much as a real-time reality. So claims then, rhetorical claims about a system that's so advanced that it can distinguish people behind masks or behind kind of scarves and images, whether that's true or not, is really about the fiction of being able to see through, to be able to discern people who are trying to obscure themselves. And so it's a rhetorical and fictional flair that embeds or encourages a trust collectively, a trust that's placed in AI, in which AI is often presented as truth and omniscience, and not a system or tool that's learning at the level of a 2-year-old, and in some cases at scale. The fourth is the fiction of a fully integrated system. And this is still part of the project of rhetoric and fiction. So we can often hear these with Project Greenlight, for example, the narrative of a kind of perfect understanding of criminality, which an automated system or an algorithmic predictive model is actually giving us. An idea of who is going to be criminal at what time and how is part of this fiction. And so as with the C4 platform, prototyping is, in this case, akin to what many students of design and technology do. They test. We test live on people. And part of that testing means that you need the cover of the fiction of perfect facial recognition instead of the truth, as in this system, only 1/3 of the cameras, as I read, having that capacity to actually match the person that's being seen with the actual person. This also depends on a rhetoric of violence, and what Fede and I were discussing as the ghost of violence, the kind of specter of crime is actually more persuasive than the reality. And the rhetoric of surveillance follows roughly the same model. So we can think of language here as a model we can also follow. The fifth is imported models and also vulnerability of populations unequally under those models. So of course, surveillance and predictive algorithms for crime thrive in authoritarian societies and in democratic societies that have rising right or authoritarian tendencies. So if we understand the Dahua cameras to have perpetuated the concentration camps of Uyghur Muslims in China, surveillance is then used as much for safety, of course, as it is for extrajudicial violence and abuse. So it's really impossible when we look at these cameras not to think about how seeing is unequal by surveillance globally and also historically, and that seeing of an automated system will also always be unequal. So in this way, if one is in a safer position, surveillance starts to seem all right, as it maps atop over being quite safe without surveillance, socially speaking or economically speaking. And in the piece that you wrote, there was a line, I think, about human rights being understood as a barrier to technology for the folks who were installing the cameras and like refining the code, which says quite a lot. And there was another troubling aspect of not knowing how the algorithms recognize local phenotypes and differences between race and facial structure, which makes for, a massive margin for error. Next to last is, or quite close to last, is context. So the specificity of what an image actually says about the person, the nuance of why anyone is in any place at a time, why they wear what they do, why they carry their body like they do. How we read an image intelligently with this context as critical visual readers, is in the process of quantification flattened. So I'd love to talk about how you, on top of seeing, also need an interpretation of seeing. And until algorithms can quantify nuanced readings of images, you're going to have flattened images and flattened readings that produce our reality. So algorithmic readings favor the clean decision, the clean reading, not complexity and not nuance, in order for an ML model to work at scale. The next is quantification of risk. So the surveillance that's conducted through the live cameras is slowly integrated into machine learning systems. And part of the gap between the suggested safety and the reality is that until the technology catches up to be truly predictive, which means being linked to a database that would help it be truly predictive, which it never really is or quite will be. Instead, you will have a risk range. The camera suggests a range of risk. And so, of course, many people have written about predictive policing and how it imagines a body becoming a 60% risk or a 75% risk within an algorithm. And so I'm intrigued by how in this app, the risk score is used as a metric for the cameras instead, which is a really lovely poetic inversion. The cameras produce an area of risk rather than bodies themselves being risky. And the entire topography of the map of a neighborhood can be split then between the risk that the cameras suggest and the likely, maybe less risky bodies that are moving through. And the final theme that I think came up, and I'm intrigued by this process of building this map and would love to hear more about the collective process, is the need for this collective mapping. Mapping machines and their logic really requires collective work and multiple perspectives to try to piece together the fiction of surveillance. And because its fiction and its logic are both always evolving and shifting and self-obfuscating, staying really close to it is essential, but you need a lot of people to do that. You need others to help reason through a body of data and its presentation to parse this kind of simulation of safety and the language around it. So I would say that AI's opacity and remove is, I agree, is not interesting. It's essential to map kind of ruthlessly the ways that we're being mapped and the way our faces and bodies and movements are being understood. And I think probably in the discussion, we're going to talk about software as ideology, embedding the values of a maker. Then the tools that have, protection embedded, or distribution of hidden information, embedded. We can think of tools that allow for access and which reflect a kind of noisier form of prototyping and tool development and a kind of collective ethos. So I'm very excited to talk with you both today. And yes, that's what I have.
Okay, so first of all, I see so many connections between what you're doing, Fede, and what Nora wrote about in Seeing, Naming, Knowing. So I would like to first go to the general point of view and ask both of you your take on the following statement, which is, why has technology having the potential for the positive is always being used for control, oppression, and above all, for monetary gain? I don't know who wants to answer first.
Well, I mean, that's a good and that's a good first question for sure. I don't know the answer. I mean, I think that it responds to a larger discussion regarding how power is distributed and how we're allowing different economic models to kind of like self-organize or like organize, be organized in response to the protection of monetary and economic interest of the people in power. I think that technology is a human expression, right? There's like many types of technologies, and we can discuss what that means. But I don't know. I think that we have to be specific on what we mean when we discuss technology. I think that recent expressions of technologies are definitely aligned with kind of like unjust distributions of power. But I don't think that that needs to be the case necessarily in the development of technology. So I feel that there's like different possible futures, possible technological futures. When discussing, I don't know, I feel that there is a very direct link regarding the way that we extract minerals from the earth and in order to develop tools and develop technologies. And I feel that that leads itself to kind of like oppressive systems and forms of colonization through innovation and so on. So I do think that there is a direct link between the development of certain types of technologies with forms of oppression. But I think that there's many expressions of technologies that don't necessarily have to respond to those logics. So and I think that that's kind of like one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. I hope that makes sense. I think that it's a very general impression, but I would be also curious to hear what Nora has to say regarding the.
Sure. Thanks, Diego. Well, I think if we're talking about technologies of surveillance, I think we could move beyond technology and see the different ways that governments and societies have always been tracking people unequally, like cameras or no cameras. And so obviously I'm speaking from a US context, but when I think globally, I think of ways that people have been sorted or named or categorized, like that we do that in language, and then we do that socially. And then cities are gridded based on those, like whether it's a caste system or different forms of caste, like that are exported globally, you have a city that's slotted in that way. And then when you bring into that environment a technological tool that can claim to see all, I mean, it is a matter of tools being used by forces that are in power to like serve their interests. But I think that takes out the kind of bias that's embedded within the tool, which I'm sure we will get to. So when you map something that is all seeing and put it in the hands of an infrastructure that's always been seeing and tracking, and labeling people according to like metrics of risk and safety, I think it's a self-reinforcing loop. It's not that the tool is introducing a new problem, it's that issue has always been there and the tool amplifies it. That's also a very general answer. I'm sorry, but I'm sure we can get more specific.
I think that's very much related to the case of counter surveillance. No, if we're arguing that the technology is a tool and it's used improperly by humans and their nature, the case for counter surveillance rises as one of the possible solutions. Do we really think counter surveillance is possible when we're facing such an almighty force?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent it is possible to completely skew our participation in these seeing mechanisms. I think that there are many kind of like day-to-day suggestions that we could possibly discuss among all of us, and there's many examples of projects that artists and activists have developed over the years regarding tactics to prevent the recognition of facial surveillance systems and so on. But I think that the main issue is that those countermeasures are not really practical. It's really hard to be to voluntarily be excluded from those vision mechanisms. So avoiding surveillance has become even harder in recent years with facial recognition and these types of tools. I don't know. I think that there's, and I'm sure we'll probably, or I think that there's a distinction that it's important to be made, maybe kind of like upfront to our conversation, where we could discuss the idea of surveillance and the idea of like data capture, for example, which are two different, or like there, I think that they could belong to the same kind of like general idea around how we are monitored as kind of like physical and digital actors. But if we understand surveillance as kind of like the more literal understanding of that concept, where like people are monitored by tracking devices and different technologies as one type of surveillance, and then the idea of like data capture as something that could seem as a more passive form of surveillance, but that at the end of the day kind of like condition the ways in which we are perceived by machines and different knowledge production mechanisms, and I feel that the translation or the transformation of our behavior in the form of data is actually also quite troubling. So I feel that we're kind of like facing the verge in a way of a kind of like larger societal social conversation regarding kind of like this false dichotomy between security and privacy. And what I think we should do is kind of like, maybe, I mean, I think that it's productive to develop, kind of like going back to your question, it is productive to develop countermeasures and counter surveillance tools in order but rather than really in order to avoid the detection of these systems. And that's why I think the tool that we're developing is kind of like rather a poetic, discursive device rather than I mean, I hope that it will serve tactics, but I think that it is more of a form of conversation, right? So what I think we should do is to kind of like position ourselves, have these discussions, and develop a position regarding that in a way that we can, as a social exercise, demand, you know, like different forms of preventing security in cities and so on.
I agree. I mean, I think your project, Fede, gives me a lot of hope, in part because of the discursive potential. And it's about, you know, it helps, I can imagine it will help the volunteers who are working on it. And if it were to become like a wider, like an app that's used by many people, helps people feel invested in their city in a different way. Mm-hmm. You can feel invested invested in your community. And understand that your community is only as strong as the most vulnerable among you. And so that feeling is very much lost right now in our feeling of day-to-day isolation, COVID or other, just digital isolation in general. And practices of collective counter surveillance, like kind of train us into a networked collectivity, a communal spirit, which can be quite abstract, but then I think the practice of it in an app like this can be translated into reality. I mean, when you hold your smartphone as a computer, when you have a computer in your hand, and then you can download an app like Citizen or Neighbor, which are apps that are used here to, you know, report your neighbors or report strange activity in your neighborhood, and that causes all sorts of problems. Counter surveillance is also surveilling these tendencies we have to surveil others, like the tendency we have in our own technologies to do exactly what we're critiquing. So I guess right now I'm thinking about charting the different ways that we each surveil each other, I think, which this year has made us very aware of our own positions within systems of power. So I think of my own city and what counter-surveillance would mean here. So I'm a teacher, I'm part of a school, I'm a gendered and racialized body living in a homogenous place. I also have like social advantages from being a writer and teacher. There are class advantages that come with that, so I'm not going to pretend like that's not real. I also enact the logics of digital seeing whenever I pick my phone up. I like zoom in on faces. I look at faces within, pictures of crowds. I'm swept up in outrage about people not wearing masks. And so I find myself in a loop of affect in small ways because of the context we're living in politically, to accept surveillance testing or to accept contact tracing. And so in the absence of a robust like healthcare system or social support, technological solutions are something that we are kind of worn down to accept. So I think of counter surveillance as like surveilling myself in some ways, like surveilling how the logic of surveillance creeps into your mind and makes you indifferent and accept this as the way things have to be. So.
Yeah, it is not as if the act of seeing wouldn't be violent, right? In its own rights, and I think that there's a history to thinking about, kind of like the relationship between how we have organized society, kind of like visually, and the machines that we have developed in order to kind of like hone that vision that at the end of the day becomes usable for the peoples in power. But I kind of want to go back to what you were saying about the idea of this tool or the prototype I'm working on being kind of like a collective engagement with the city. I pretty much like that. And it made me think as well as something that you were saying before, right? Like this common argument regarding privacy, where people say that or people think, and where if you don't have anything to hide, then you shouldn't necessarily worry or care about a system like that or about your privacy and so on. And I think that that's I think that that's misleading or a kind of like false understanding on how these systems operate, because it really isn't about kind of like the individual behavior. I mean, I think that they do affect individuals for sure, and there's like a I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why that's the case. There's even just the idea of like a false positive kind of case and so on. But I think that it is, as you were also kind of like comparing it with the COVID experience, where it is kind of like more of a collective, the commitment that we're making with kind of like constraining our behavior in relationship to COVID is more in support of a communal understanding of how of kind of like this broader benefit for society. But I think that with surveillance technology specifically, and with what I was mentioning regarding the way that not only our faces are captured and that might affect us individually, but like our faces becoming data that it's then kind of like organizing public policies and so on, and only public policies, but a whole kind of like economy, like a whole economy kind of like built around the extraction of data. And how that new form of exchanging value also kind of like manufactures the way that the knowledge is produced, and also the way that kind of like reality is understood. So I feel that I feel that the issue with these systems goes kind of like beyond the individual case of like if a person not being recognized or identified properly, which I think that it's incredibly problematic. But I think that it scopes out and kind of like becomes kind of like more abstract in the way that our behaviors are kind of like monetized through the logics of data.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's on two sides. There are many problems we could talk about today, but the two are that we've outlined are that an ML system can badly name, and a image can be taken out of context, and you could imagine a future scenario where you are mistaken for another person. That is within the context of racialized seeing, right. And criminality already enforcing police bias, that's a huge problem. Right. But the other part of this is the incremental ways that we are brought into a larger system, and like we move away from being seen to actually being like seers, which I would argue that we are. So yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Diego, I think you're muted.
Okay, so I was saying, Fede, when we talk about a false positive, we're talking about flaws in the technology, right? So can you both tell us more about the flaws that are built into this technology, not even the ones that are created through a bias of the creators, but the actual flaws of the systems?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can speak specifically to the Coahuila system because I think that it really depends, and this is a big part of the way that we should speak about these flaws and shortcomings of these technologies is the specifics of how they are implemented. In Coahuila, for example, I mean where do I start? There are many things. One big part of it is the DAWA technology specifically sold their products to the government in Coahuila with false promises of their accuracy of the system. So the government of Coahuila has the perception that the system works under certain accuracy levels, but those accuracy levels are kind of like within optimal vision situations, let's say. So in Coahuila, they're having a lot of problems because they actually use the existing infrastructures of the cities. So for example, the image that Nora showed of a bridge, and those bridges are too far away from moving faces at the speed of the cars in the highways of Coahuila. So they're like they install the system, and now they're realizing that the ways that it was installed doesn't really help with the identification process. So if you look, there's like a whole infrastructure design that is erratic in Coahuila, and I think that that's particular to that implementation. But facial recognition technologies themselves tend. It really depends on the way that they are trained and on the way and the technology, or like the databases basically of images of faces that they use in order to be able to detect faces and to detect faces among faces. And so in Coahuila specifically, because it is, the algorithm of DAWA is highly protected under corporate logics, and as a secret, the state, like the Coahuila authorities, don't really have access to the algorithm, so they're not even able to implement verification mechanisms in order to see how it operates or it works. So it's just running, and they don't really know. The system in Coahuila hasn't found any single match, right, between the identities of people that are being filmed and the identities of people that exist in the databases. So they haven't found any match, but they don't really know whether it is because that the person that they're looking for hasn't walked in the streets or driven or whatever. But they just don't know, and they don't have access to the actual algorithm or the operating system of the technology. So that's really problematic. But anyway, these technologies tend to just mimic or amplify the biases or the existing patterns within the databases that they use to train the technology. So as long as we don't know, and Nora was discussing the idea of like getting access or like knowing a model, but it's the same case with databases. If we don't know the algorithm and we don't know the databases that they use in order to train it, we don't really know, or it's really hard to be able to have access to the possible flaws that they may have. In the case of Coahuila, for example, they asked DAWA to to improve their algorithm in order to detect local or Mexican faces. And that's obviously an extremely problematic concept, because there's not such thing as a Mexican phenotype or anything like that. And they don't even know what criteria the private company used in order to determine what a Mexican face looked like, you know? So all of those decisions, which are decisions made by engineers, which are people with their own understandings of reality, inform the way that technology works. And the problem in the case of Coahuila specifically is that, like, the authorities that are using the system in order to arrest people don't have access or understanding of what the system really is. They just know that they bought these cameras that are, and these like futuristic interfaces, and that it looks fancy and it's like a good political tool, but they don't really know how they function, and they don't really even know if they function, because so far they haven't, though they are performing arrests with the traditional monitoring traditional forms of monitoring. Face recognition itself in Coahuila hasn't been successful, hasn't worked. There's no match that the system has thrown.
I think this is a good moment maybe to hold on and really ask yourself, or ask Nora, who knows a great deal about it, of how these facial recognition technologies work. I know in Seeing, Naming, Knowing, you offer a great example through the artwork of Trevor Paglen. So can you explain just exactly how these cameras work, how they gather information?
Sure. I mean, I can do a video. I think we could both do this. So I actually wanted to. Could I follow up on the last question really quickly and then move into that? Yeah, because I actually have an answer that I think can pair the two together. But you know, moving back to this question of like moving away from the conversation around bias, I think there are two conversations. There's one, the inherent biases of databases, and then how a machine learning system that's based on visual images needs visual data, and it needs as much visual data as possible. And so when we talk about the ways in which both machine learning and predictive algorithms are, you know, in process and are in process of being like refined, the suggestion that, you know, pairs with that is that if you had more data, if you had more faces, if you had as many faces as possible, you could refine the algorithm to make the false positives drop from 90 to 70 to 30. But that slope still inculcates you into the visual logic of the system. So you give it more data so it can predict and match faces better to like a database of more faces. The reason false positives show up is both because of bias and on being unable to recognize the phenotype of a face, and also the scarcity within the database of like being able to actually match the face seen with the supposed criminal that you're looking for. And so it's both a question of whether the model of prediction is accurate. Does it actually predict action in the world, or does it leverage fear and guesswork and predisposition to see certain people as criminal or not? And my worry is in these systems where they are being refined, there's no way to know whether it's being refined or not. And then that lack of care to whether the prediction is actually truthful or not, or correct or not, is a reflection of a lack of care for the populations that are being surveilled already, like camera surveillance or no. So software privileges like our legibility to a system of record, whether you have a license plate or you have certain kinds of papers or you live in the right neighborhood or area code. So if machine learning and visual data systems were to move towards more accurate data to create a more diverse image population, that still suggests that the answer is more surveillance and more tracking. So it's a self-perpetuating loop. It's designed that way. So I think we could probably talk about software as ideology, and you'll probably transition into that. But I think it's crucial to note the loop that it perpetuates itself. You need more data in order for it to be more accurate. And then there's on the other side the question of whether it should exist at all. Just because it can be made does not mean it should be made. Fede, I don't know if you wanted to pick up the question.
Yeah, I mean, I could very roughly try to explain how a camera like that works on a practical level. It is basically a type of CCTV camera that is capturing images and video both simultaneously at street level, and it sends information via an online connection to centers which are both monitoring the live feed of the system, but also the live feed is, and the images themselves are being processed by software that has artificial intelligence and that was trained in order to segment or to kind of like abstract the faces themselves out of the images and then compare those faces, like the geometry, the biometric data, how it's called, of those faces with existing databases of identities of people. So these are images of faces which identities have been previously identified. So in Coahuila, for example, a big struggle that the government is facing is to actually get access to meaningful databases in order to contrast and compare the images that are being captured on the streets. And we could go into how the AI actually works, but I think that in very few words, what it was the way that these systems, that these processes are coded and developed is by what's called supervised or supervised training, which is basically letting code engage with huge amounts of data, which in this case is images of faces, and the code itself, the AI kind of like self-organizes that information and deciphers kind of like patterns within that data, which in this case again is images of faces. So the algorithm becomes sensitive basically to the idea, to the visual understanding of what a face means, and that's the way that it's able to kind of like compare between what's being captured in the streets and what they have like preloaded on a system. I don't know if that, I hope that made sense, and I don't know if Nora, you want to add something to it.
Yeah, and I think another key part of this is the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning. A lot of AI research is now moving towards unsupervised learning. So you let you let the system learn itself over time how to what predictions it's made that are accurate and what is wrong. And so it continually teaches itself and is given, like, for example, GPT-3 was given, it was just a natural language model and created a lot of excitement this summer, and was given, you know, everything in the internet, that all of the words in the internet to teach itself how to write. And now writes really quite like convincing prose, but part of it is it is about having a massive amount of computational power so it can teach itself and be left alone. And so like there's not a person who needs to like keep correcting the model or refining it. And so OpenAI and Microsoft are more moving into that direction, and they're starting to look at how visual systems can also tag and create a system of naming images that is through unsupervised learning. And so, and it becomes more distant in that way.
The initial example, I think it's a good one because it is, as you were saying, they use the existing text on the internet in order to teach this algorithm how to write, right? So for example, if you tell that algorithm specifically to write something about Coahuila, it would likely tell violent stories because what's been told about Coahuila is, or like what's existing in the internet about, I mean, there are obviously many stories about Coahuila, but the pattern, and this is, I'm just speculating, but there might be a pattern regarding a narrative around that particular place in the world. And the same is true for when you organize information like that regarding people or regarding the way that people look and so on. And I don't know if, I mean, I feel that maybe this is also a good moment to talk a little bit more about what we mean when we're saying software as ideology, right? How ideology is embedded within technologies, but specifically within software, and more specifically within software design with AI.
I know in your book, Nora, you go into great length to explain these implicit biases when the software is made, and you one of the examples you cite is the foundation of USA as a nation, and also the implicit biases of the makers of technology in the area around San Francisco.
Mm. Yeah, it's 3 years since I've written it, but I remember, yes, I remember that section. And I remember a long section in there in which I was trying to grapple with Wendy Chun and Alexander Galloway, who are really the folks who brought at least into the critical mainstream the idea that software is not neutral and technology is not neutral in their examination of interface design. And so, yes, software is ideology, and that ideology is more often oppressive, unequal, and flattening. And I think it's key that we frame this knowledge of tech as not being neutral, but further like acknowledge that the idea of tech as neutral, or as science as having this objective neutrality, is important to see before person even comes into the picture. So I think I mentioned earlier, people often say, like with gun control here, that, you know, a gun is a tool and it depends on who's holding it for what reason. I hear that a lot in descriptions of technology. But the difference with software is that before there's a user, there's a set of values embedded into its design and its code, which channel its activation into the world. And further, because of the rhetoric and language we have around science as objective and neutral, we tend to not see that. That's also part of the design. And so I think that in the case of C4 and these cameras that Fede, you were looking at, the rhetoric of truth and objectivity and neutrality and precision is a huge part of the movement of an acceptance of the cameras. And there's a lot of government officials quoted in the piece that you shared, who are thrilled about, like, finally we can now outsource truth to this system. We don't need to make these decisions on our own. And so, as I mentioned before, like the fiction of neutrality is a huge part of how we accept surveillance.
Yeah, I mean, in Coahuila, well, first of all, I think that the example of the gun is like really striking, because I feel that the purpose, or like a gun is designed with a very specific purpose in mind. So I feel that regardless of who use it, the end result is the same, right? So I don't know. I don't know in what context that example helps, but yeah, it's. I mean, in Coahuila, unfortunately, again, we didn't have access to, or we haven't had access to the Dahua engineers, but we did have access to the people operating technology. So in this case, yeah, I mean, it is. It's. Yeah, it wasn't surprising, but it is definitely telling that even as the technology is kind of like underperforming and even failing to perform, it's clear that it didn't really came through, or like it didn't come through, like the project didn't come through a well thought through security strategy, but as a series of kind of like diplomatic and political contingencies with China, and also as a way to kind of like fulfill the kind of like the campaign promises of the current government. So there's definitely that aspect of how technology is kind of like simulating the sense of violence, or like the threat of violence, but it's also kind of like abusing or exploiting the history of violence, the actual history of violence of the state. And that's, yeah, I mean, in my opinion, reprehensible from the government. The ways in which these like very real histories are being, yeah, exploited again by the authorities. I don't know, I think that in Coahuila it's also particular that well, yeah, that violence is in many ways, in many cases, perpetrated and enacted by authorities themselves. In Coahuila and New Mexico in general, it's very difficult distinguish from organized crime and government. In 2019, only there was like a 50% increase in the complaints that were presented to the Human Rights Commission of the state, again in Coahuila. And most of those were against police departments that were accused of the most violent crimes possible. So again, yeah, I think that you're right regarding how branding and politics and the way that these systems are presented and represented, like in the images, in the image you share, right, like next to the kind of like very heroic image of like a COVID, well, yeah, kind of like a health worker in above the bridge. But I feel that, yeah, I think that this kind of like narrative regarding how yeah, the speculation of security, but also the abuse or the exploitation of the rhetoric of fear and kind of like a whole branding around the system is definitely portrayed in the Coahuila case. Yeah, I feel that I went kind of like in a little tangent there, but yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of like software being ideology is not only truth in the kind of like in the common, not common, but in the discussion regarding like how algorithms like amplify the, you know, like the decisions and the beliefs and the perceptions of the people that create them, but it's also like a way to software technology is also a way to or aligns itself with certain ideologies. In the case of Coahuila, it's a political program.
So in your opinion, how would we even attempt to shatter these logics? How do we build databases where you know, that are as diverse as a population, or how do we regulate the use of such technologies in a place like Coahuila, where we can't even distinguish between a policeman and a criminal? Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what the answer in the case of Coahuila really is, because I mean, my take on it is that it should be, that the system should be indefinitely suspended. I don't think that there's the conditions, not legal or social, in order to operate a technology like that. So I think that I don't think that there should be a future for a technology like such in the context of Coahuila. I mean, I think that when we speak about like introducing diversity to these systems, I think that it's a really interesting conversation, because I think that it's tricky because it's undeniable that correcting these systems and making them more diverse, less racist, and so on should be a widespread effort. But at the same time, it's not always true that the populations that are being targeted would want these systems to be more, you know, like more accurate in a way, because an erratic system is also is for sure problematic, but also for a more precise one might be even more so for the people that are being persecuted and oppressed by these systems. So I feel that, I mean, I don't know what you think about that, Nora, but I think that the whole notion of like algorithmic representation is also being kind of like exploited by the corporate sector as a way to kind of like self-correct their mechanisms, but mainly for commercial interest, and in a way, this kind of like reintroduces what you were discussing as well, which is the notion that detectability is kind of like an agreed upon human attribute, and also that technology is supposedly objective, right? So the idea of like visibility, or the idea of like being seen as being something that most people desire, is not necessarily always the case, and especially not the case for communities and groups of people that are being particularly targeted by the systems. So I feel that there's like a good case that could be made regarding refusing to participating in these systems, and many people have kind of like written about that right to refuse being seen.
Right, and exactly the right to refuse, the right to opacity. I think of in your project the way that the city can be remapped. I think there was there's a line about the poetry of having people not take the most effective route once they understand that there are zones of risk, and that being a kind of end, is a way to enact opacity in your day-to-day. And so I think it's important that the intelligent city, or the prototype of the intelligent city as it's being tested, is about a city becoming more intelligent, the way that AI becomes more intelligent, where intelligence is misconstrued for one, because it's not intelligence, it's pseudo or simulation of intelligence, or partial in kind of like intelligent ways of acting, like one intelligent model, but not intelligence, of course, as we understand it. And if intelligence is, the intelligence of a system is taken as infallible rather than in process, then the understanding of safety is something that becomes infallible as well. And so just going back to your point about government branding and official statements, government rhetoric and official statements from corporations fill in that gap between reality and the trust that is needed. And so it's like, I think paying attention to the language is just as important. But to your question of like whether the system can fully contain the diversity of all faces or all beings, I think, well, do we want a more perfect facial recognition, or do we want governance that doesn't outsource its power to automated systems? I would rather, at this point, the latter. I want I hope for social solutions for social problems, not technological solutions to social problems. So San Francisco, I think, has banned facial recognition. Lots of countries are considering banning facial recognition. I think, especially working at a design school where a lot of people are designing technology, it's not a technological solution. And tech solutionism, like we've been discussing here, is its own kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And just because a thing should be made and it can be made and works doesn't mean it should be made. So I'm not sure what a more ethical database or a more unbiased database would actually look like, other than a perfect database for an algorithmic system that's learned to correct for every single possible life scenario outside of just being a body matching a body in a database. Like, we need a more complex understanding within technology of how to name, which I guess my argument hasn't really changed in a few years. Oh well, but yes, I think it's about the danger of looking for more tech solutions and refining the technology towards getting to this perfect seeing or perfect kind of system. And maybe the tech is not a solution to anything. We need social solutions.
Yeah, I like the idea that there might be a ban coming for facial recognitions in different cities.
Yeah.
So I would like to take that advantage to ask you both to pull away from the technology for a second and give us some advice while that moment comes as to how we can act as citizens. How can we, because most of the time, a lot of the surveillance that happens goes through an initial buying of the user, right? So we forego our rights when we use technology many times. So what can we do to subvert the oppressive powers of technology on a daily basis?
I could give a first answer, maybe if you wanted to close. I was going to say that it's the awareness of cameras is part of it, but it's also about tracking these very, very subtle, small changes. And I was thinking about this morning. I can't teach if I don't plug into surveillance testing. And so if I miss a test, in a week, I'll lose access to my classroom, which means, huge personal and financial consequences. So, surveillance is a kind of creep, and that happens mentally, like it's very slow. And like 9 months ago, I couldn't imagine, as a critic of surveillance, that I would, I'd be logging into some micro surveillance system. So it's under duress that I did that. And I was struck over the summer with the Floyd protests that contact tracing was starting to be used as a way to describe tracing protesters. And so I just think for like practical kinds of social solutions, I think there's the rhizomatic thinking and the focus on mutual aid that a lot of community-based tech projects are taking on. So Fedi's project obviously is an example of this. I think of socially centered design. They have a manifesto around designing for rights or for the commons or for the civic commons or for public health. Design that kind of redistributes technological resources for equity. And going back to Detroit, you know, in response to Project Greenlight, there's one of my favorite projects, Detroit Community Tech Project, which really focuses on community-owned stewardship of technology. So designing technological infrastructure to shape the neighborhood and the city that they live in. And so community ownership of digital systems, sorry, I can't really move away from technology, but community ownership for digital systems, like with an aim towards digital justice, and is I think the future of like design in this area is having ethical design that comes through the collective. And that's where my hope lies, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Nora just said. In Coahuila specifically, I think that a big social challenge that there is, even for having a tool like the one we're designing to work, is that actually most people in Coahuila are in agreement that a system like that is needed, right? And I think that that's an example of how we tend to we tend to give away our information, or we tend to comply to some of these technologies, or like what they expect from us in order to get access to products that are convenient, right, to us. In this case, the convenience of a false sense of safety in the streets of Coahuila. But I think that it is kind of like this paradoxical behavior of like giving away our freedoms, our privacy in this case, in order to have access to a tool that that gives something in exchange for data, right? And I do believe, I mean, I think that we all have like a personal challenge in order to develop kind of like sufficient digital literacy and make informed decisions as we engage with these products. However, I also think that that's a lot to ask from people. I think that products at least as products are as obscure and inscrutable as they tend to be. So even as I think that we as users, we should kind of like, there's like things for us to learn. I think that we should ultimately hold companies and people in positions of power accountable and responsible for the designs of their products that have like incalculable reaches are beyond what we can understand. So I think that ultimately that's what we should do. I think that there's a personal responsibility, and I think that we should be able to develop this literacy and inform our choices, make decisions and so on. But I think that ultimately we should make companies and governments accountable for the development of these types of technologies. Again, I think that there's like many different paths for technological futures. Let's remember that machines are only the results of people's choices. And I do think that it's reprehensible for companies to persist in making products that are addictive and that work only through the logics of clickbait mechanisms. With facial recognition technologies is even worse, I think, because there's not even a chance to decide whether you want your information to be extracted and processed, right? So it is not possible to consent to the identification process. So I think that kind of like splits in a way facial recognition technology as even a more pervasive and oppressive technology from other technology that we do make a decision and comply with our participation. In this case, these are systems that are installed in public spaces and that affect the ways that we have organized citizens' freedoms. So I mean, I feel that that's like maybe too big of an answer, but I think that there's not many options but to resist and fight these systems back.
So I would take it that none of you believe in the Luddite way, right? So there's no way to destroy our technology.
I mean, the only thing that I would say to that is maybe just going back to something that I said before. I think that technology is an expression of humanity, and there's different forms of technology. We're engaging with a ton of types of technology as we speak, right? Like language is an example of that, and then the Zoom interface is another example of that. I think that we have to be specific when we discuss that. I do think that there's different paths for technological development. When we speak about technology, I mean, right now we're discussing face recognition, which is a type of artificial intelligence, which is a type of digital technology that performs through the internet and so on. So it's like highly specific. So I think that we need to be able to kind of like break those things down in order to discuss what's whether you can escape or not the system, or where you can refuse to participate in an act of sin or not. I do think that there's a need to kind of like soften the advancement of technologies for social reasons that we just discussed, but also for ecological obvious ones. But I don't necessarily think that technology itself is the problem, but the way that it is implemented, by who and what interest is it protecting. So I feel that it's like I mean, I don't think that there's ways to escape participating in technology overall, just because it is such a broad concept. But I do think that there's ways to kind of like reorganize the ways in which it is developed, or at least the types of technologies that we're discussing at the moment.
Agreed. I think I never, sometimes in these talks or these critiques, I forget to mention that technology is amazing. Like I always have hope and not technological solutions, but like the effective, poetic, discursive potential that technology opens in terms of, you know, redistributing information, redistributing resources, creating community, all of these like early utopic ideas of that were embedded into like the Whole Earth Catalog, or you know, access to tools. And so over time, the way that, you know, the ownership of technology has been moved away from the average person, so it is now this like kind of priest-like ownership of the main core of information, is the moving from like open architecture to this closed architecture over 20 years. That is like the problem. And so probably contradicting myself here a bit, but you know, if you have ethical design of technologies, technology can completely change a city. It can change. I don't want to say change people's lives. It's not the note that I want to end on, but I think of the Gibson quote about the future is here, but it's not. It's just not equally distributed, and I think technology obviously amplifies that, but the more that you have people feel comfortable, have ownership, have the information, have the knowledge about how tech is like deployed against them, the more that they can enter the fray. And that's the entire ethos of programming and reprogramming, is if the system's not working, you can remake it.
Yeah, I think this is a great note to end, to open up to questions. I want to thank you both for your engaging thoughts and for giving us a big insight on to what to do until we get ethical designing technology, or until we smash our phones. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego.
Thank you, Diego.
I wonder if Rejane or Juan Pablo have some question. I would like to, to tell many things.
I have too many. No, I'm playing. I have a comment. I think at the end, we reached the point that I was going to ask, but I would like to say what I thought while you both. I want to thank you very much for your talk. I thought that was great. It made me think a lot. And but I come from semiotics, and yes, everything is language, and nothing in this planet, from this point of view, we know is dealing with mediation and is dealing with the use of technology, right? So from this point, I want to say that the first question Diego asked you guys was about what's good about it. How can we do something good? And I'm saying that because I have Lynn Hershman a lot in my mind all the time. And Lynn Hershman says that an artist like I am needs to use the technology of its time, right? My time. I need to use the technology of my time. So when I think that, I also think, especially because we are involved in a program like that, that I need to invent some technology. So listening to you gives me that feeling that I need to do something good. I need to use technology to do something good, to make, yes, people better. And we know that without Zoom, without what we have now, without virtual reality that Tanya and I studied in the 80s, nothing that's happening, I really trust. Something wrong. This is one thing. But another thing I want to talk with just, you know him, this guy is crazy, and it's a German geek. He's super into artificial intelligence, and he has a model. Saying
I think that, I mean, I feel like a broken record somehow, but I mean, I think that specifically with facial recognition technologies and the ones that are implemented in Coahuila, it's hard to imagine a good use for those technologies. For example, in Coahuila, the authorities, they say that they're also going to use that in order to look for that could be a potential good use, right, for a technology like that. But the problem with the design of that technology, I mean, I think that you have to work backwards from the goal you want to reach. If that would be the goal you want to reach with that technology, then you have to design it in order to perform the task. In Coahuila, for example, the technology that they're using does not detect women as easily as they detect men. And in the context of Coahuila, most disappeared people, more people missing are women, right? So even for performing that task that would be good, the design of the technology itself does not allow for that type of use, right? It's kind of like the same case as the example of the gun. Like a gun, like, yes, try and find a good use for a weapon. And so in this, like specifically these types of cameras, these types of technologies, they're designed to criminalize behavior, and it's really hard to figure out a different use for that specific type of technology. I do think that artificial intelligence, for example, there's like significantly good uses in medicine, in the arts, in the creation of culture, and in poetry even, and so on. But I think that specifically with facial recognition technologies and those types of systems in the way that they are designed and organized at the moment, is really hard to imagine a good use for it.
It's a really, really good question that you asked. I think a little outline of an answer. I'm thinking of a kind of workshop that I ran a couple of years ago at the School for Poetic Computation. And the project was, how do you imagine a simulation or a technological model that is not extractive? It was just a simple question of like, let's think of some other values other than capitalist extraction that a piece of software can be based around. And it was extremely hard. Like we just were trying to come up with a list of words, and we could come up with all the ways in which technology embodies like the worst impulses. But then as we spent a couple of hours trying to brainstorm, and people came up with networked thinking, or thinking like a rhizome, or thinking the way that mycelium or bacteria or microbes like function like within a non-hierarchical way of thinking. And so networks do model that. Systems design can model completely different like non-hierarchical ways of thinking. But also, if we are talking about bias embedded within systems, you can think of, for example, the gun example. I would think one good use for a weapon would be self-defense. I'm just thinking aloud. Or like hunt, I don't know, people who love hunting, like they find guns. So it's like in that context, their specific context. But if we were to extrapolate more widely, like what are ways that we want to predict the world? Like what would be useful ways for prediction? Climate change obviously is a great way to predict, a great thing to predict for. So the critique of the Hurricane Katrina simulations was in part that they didn't put people in a lot of the simulation videos, so like first responders couldn't respond to it. So if you could predict like water level rise, used to live in Miami, like simulations are used for water level rise to help form architecture, but then also escape routes, or like planned maps 4 or 5 years ahead of time of how people can move. Like that's a perfect example of a productive use of a predictive like technology. I think of if you have data on how health outcomes have been in a certain part of a city or certain neighborhood, you can think about like different map routes for ambulances, or like different ways that range based on like historical data of like health outcomes in a certain area, because that's unequal in many, like at least US cities for sure. So it's using all this massive data and then intervening and then coming up with like a productive like use that is towards health or justice or some other end, as a slow way of inching away from a non-extractive model. It's a very abstract answer, but that helps.
I'm very happy. Thank you.
I'm also, I want to thank you both. It was really, really interesting and exciting. I really like those topics as well. And yet they are so complex. They can be very overwhelming, right? And so I can sort of relate to, like Nora's ideas of sort of owning and assuming our own roles in these surveillance technologies and our participation in them. and also Fede's sort of notions of community sort of surveillance of the surveillance systems in a way. But you have to take into account the social, the political, the technical, the technological, to really understand these kinds of systems. So sort of where I'm trying to go, and the question I'm trying to do is just to ask, how do you start to investigate these systems? How do you interrogate these systems? And like when you're sort of starting an artistic project or a research project, and also in the context of prototypes, when you look at such a complex technology, with such broad implications, where do you stand? What's your starting point? And how do you navigate those complexities, both as a researcher and an artist?
Well, I can answer for myself, and with this specific project in mind. I was invited to do a residency in Shenzhen in China, and I was introduced and I engaged with those types of technologies very directly in the way that I walked around the cities and in the research that I was doing over there. And while, I mean, this is again like maybe just like a very kind of like personal answer to your question, but like as I was in China researching these companies and these technologies, I got noticed that the government of Coahuila was purchasing a system like this, and I started following the case. And when I came back early this year back to Mexico, it was a very natural impulse to start kind of like reading what was available out there regarding the system, which at the moment was still kind of like a political promise. And then I just kind of like started getting in touch with the people that in the government and the people that were involved with the project somehow. But anyway, this is maybe a longer story. I realized that given it was the first case in Mexico of the type it was, and that most of the information around the system was being protected by the government, it had to become kind of like a kind of like a journalistic enterprise. So I partner with Quinto Elemento Lab and with Paloma and with people that have that experience much more than I do. And we just engaged in, I don't know how to say it in English, but on freedom of information acts and through kind of like transparency existing mechanisms, we started kind of like collecting all of this information. And for example, in the slides I showed, each number it was a fight in order to be able to have like a breakdown of the system. All of that information is not public; it's information that we had to fight for. And so again, it's a project that I started working on at the beginning of this year, and it took us 10 months in order to be able to publish an article on it. So it's a group of journalists and lawyers and working kind of like being like trying to decipher how the system is implemented in Coahuila. And like through that pressure, we were able at some point to sit down with the authorities and actually be able to look through the system and very surprisingly they showed us how it works and how it doesn't works. So, I mean, I think that in my particular case, it's a subject that I'm engaged with in my overall practice, and I was working around facial recognition systems in China, and it just happened to be that the system like that was purchased by a government of a place that I'm familiar with, and it is the first time that happened in the country. So I feel that it's an important case study, or it was. I just had kind of like this natural impulse in order to research it. But yeah, I mean, I feel that there's like different research tactics that I had the privilege to learn through this project specifically, because they don't come necessarily from my practice as an artist, as a kind of like more academic researcher, but like from the world of journalism and litigation processes.
I can give an answer from teaching artists and thinking about artistic research with young artists who are trying to work with digital media. And my first job out of college was as a fact checker when magazines still hired fact checkers. And so my job would be to check every single thing from every angle about anything, any fact that is like named, so the magazine wouldn't get sued. And so I think a lot about that when to undertaking like the process of like investigating or uncovering or revealing the logic of a technology, which I think some artistic research can stop, can indulge in that. And that's not a critique, but just a statement of revealing the logic is one step. But as an artistic material life, or you know, their safety is involved. One thing I talk about with my students a ton is, what is your position within this research? How do you position yourself as investigator or revealer? What does that say about your position within the system that you're entering? Why do you get to come in and leave? And like, what is that act of getting to come in and leave? And how do you push against that and try to embed yourself within you know, a network of people who are actually affected within, whether it's a technology, you know, a network of people or some other problem that they're trying to design, intervene in. They're, you know, it's always that critical step of like, what is my role in this? And have I really looked carefully at what I'm doing here and what I want to get out of this? And if it is about having an activist bent, then how do I make my research accessible, legible, and usable? And I think my favorite project from last year was Forensic Architecture's Whitney Biennial, the Triple Chaser project, in which they not only developed a machine learning model to look at tear gas canisters, but then made it open source. I mean, I just thought that was it's an incredible project where anyone can now run the model to see if that is being used at protests, and like that was used all summer. And that's artistic research, it's activism, but it's also decentering the artist as like hero, I think. So that's sorry, we're in the middle of like final critique, so I'm very much in that that mode.
Oh, so just to echo a little bit what Nora is saying, I think that there's like very low-fi ways to kind of like reverse engineer some of these systems, especially when you have like, I mean, some of them are extremely protected, as like the one in Coahuila and other digital technologies and so on. But even with the Coahuila cameras, for example, there was this moment that was like striking, because even just as we were mapping and just like photographing and so on the cameras, I remember this moment where I was standing underneath one of these poles with multiple cameras, and I realized that one of the cameras was actually following my movements, and I was able to just like position myself against the camera, in front of the camera, and kind of like slowly move around, and I look at the camera kind of like following me back and forth. So that was kind of like a way for me to be able to speculate that there was a person behind the camera, kind of like monitoring the space, and not necessarily that big. Well, and just to back track a little bit, we didn't know at the moment that whether all of the cameras had facial recognition, and that was a way for us to understand that there was actually a system that were like police officers were monitoring specific cameras and in a direct way, and that it was not all kind of like automatic system. And we were able to kind of like figure that out, because even as we were like covering our faces, the mechanism was still following us. So it was like easy to be able to, or like speculate that in that case specifically, that there was a person behind the camera. So it's like a very specific thing within like a very big infrastructure of surveillance, but that gave us some insight in how the system works. So I feel that there's like, and that insight was already meaningful in order to make questions around like on the system. So so I feel that there's like ways to kind of like, again, to kind of like reverse engineer the system just by engaging with them and trying to find information based on just like on the responses and the outputs that the system gives away by and this is just an example of that.
Yeah, great, thanks. I think those are really great ideas and strategies, and also sort of like owning your own agency and just sort of understanding how you as yourself, nothing more, can really sort of start digging into these kinds of systems, right? So thank you so much. I don't know, Tanya, if you have anything else.
No, just to thank you. I think that one of the hypotheses of this set of conversations was like to think of media art or contemporary art when it's engaged with the problematization of technology may act as a wide repository of knowledge, of experiences, and of warnings. And yes, that was something that I wanted to ask, but you've been answering this from the beginning, and this closing is like amazing because yes, this agency of the artist or the artist researcher as a propagator of non-neutrality of technology and of many concepts. I think this is one of the ways, or the way that art is reverse engineering all this that is happening, and that have us now speaking through this specific interface and talking about face recognition and weapons and all these subjects that have been there for, maybe we can talk of a tradition in media art or so-called electronic art practices or whatever we may name it. But yes, thank you. No, it's wonderful to have this piece as in its stage of prototype, and also Nora as someone so important in this kind of reflection. And yes, I just want to thank you all, Diego and Gerard and everyone for this amazing conversation. Lots to think about now.
Yeah, thank you, Tania, for the invitation, and thank you, Nora and Diego, for the conversation, and thank you as well to the rest of you for organizing the event and engaging with us on the conversation.
Thank you all. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much for having us. And I just wanted to add, for the occasion of the talk, we're going to offer a free PDF download of Nora's book, which is right here. So you can just go to disonare.com and download it straight away.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.